want to talk about video game difficulty because I feel like at the minute, doing the rounds online and across the board is how hard Elden Ring's DLC is, Shadow of the Erdtree. To the point where it's being review bombed on Steam. Some of those review bombs are around performance issues, but the vast majority is about how difficult the game is in comparison to the original or the base game. That seems to be mostly centered on the fact that the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC has a bunch of collectibles called Erdtree elements or fragments.
Okay.
And you need a bunch of them to boost your character more than the standard set of stats you have going into the DLC.
Right.
And a lot of the criticism that's doing the rounds is the idea of, oh, say I had done New Game Plus 7 times, I'm level 300 and whatever it is, I should be able to steamroll this DLC, or I should be able to have a chance at this thing.
Yeah.
And then everybody is finding, regardless of what level you are, that the NPCs are just flattening you in a couple of hits, that the bosses are extremely hard. There's some specific animations in those boss fights. There's one against R'Lana, not Renala, because she was in the original game, R'Lana, who has like an orb attack that just sends out shockwaves and you can't dodge it. People have like found that you can only really dodge it using like the Bloodhound skip like move that you do where you flip over or something. Either way, I mean, Hidetaka Miyazaki said in the run-up to launch that he was really going to crank the difficulty for this thing, which is very much the case. And obviously from software stuff, the DLC is always known for being brutally hard. I never finished the Old Hunters for Bloodborne.
Yeah.
You can talk about that as much as possible. But at the minute, I wonder if it's just because Elden Ring has blown up so much that like you're getting way more mainstream people in. Like Elden Ring beat Call of Duty back in 2022 for its sales. And so I wonder if this is just what a mainstream response is to a brutally hard thing. However, I do want to say that in regards to the whole Erdtree thing, the idea of exploring the world, finding these fragments, boosting your character, even more than the base stats, I like at least the attempt of flattening all the players to the same starting point again.
Yeah.
Where the open, the new world is brutally hard, regardless of if it's your first playthrough or your 7th or whatever it is, and you need to fundamentally explore to get stronger. That was the lifeblood of Elden Ring anyway.
Yeah.
Like the idea that if something's tough up ahead of you, you just branch off and do something else. Like I like them sort of codifying that. I get the annoyance that it's predicated on collectibles because you literally have codified it. So you start thinking like, oh, well, I need 10 of these and they're somewhere to do a decent hit or to tank a hit or whatever. But I do like the idea of them trying something like this because otherwise you would have people who are multiple New Game Pluses in just rolling all the way through. I don't know if you've been following, I want to throw this last thing in. Have you been following Kai Cenat, the new he's not a new streamer, but he's new to Elden Ring. These are words that Josh Brown's never heard before. No. There's a dude called Kai Cenat who's more known for like streaming sports games, things like that. Okay. He started streaming Elden Ring and just blew the hell up because he's got this massive fan base and he's awesome. Even he's weighed in because it was like a big thing that he was playing through Elden Ring. It was like a 100-hour stream. He's doing another one, whatever. That blew up. But even he's now weighed in saying like, why the hell would they have made a DLC that was this easy for a game that's 2 years old? Like you're coming for the challenge. Like the whole point is to get stuck in, which then his clips are now being shared as like, even this guy gets it as like the idea of why it's supposed to be brutally hard.
Really interesting, this discourse, because truth be told, I'm getting all of this information from you. I've been trying to keep away from Shadow of the Erdtree as much as possible, not because I hate it, but because I cannot wait to play it, and I just don't have the time right this moment in time because of all the football that's on Scott Tilford, and it's summer in the UK, and when I go back to Elden Ring, I want to play it all the way through again because I am one of those people who is on, New Game Plus 7.
Right.
And granted, I didn't go through it as granularly as my first playthrough, but I've repeated the cycle, chasing the platinum mainly, that I am scared to boot it up and try this DLC because I worry about being underleveled by just running through that game over and over again.
I guess that's the thing, you fundamentally will be. That's kind of what they're acknowledging, which I quite like that.
Me too. It is I have seen the discourse, when the reviews came out and there were a lot of people criticizing some reviews for calling it too hard, and now to see the discourse shift to it being partially review bombed because people are finding it too hard. And I do think, I can't comment on the game specifically or the mechanics that it's introduced, but it is interesting what you said there about Elden Ring being so much bigger than the previous games, which were already big, but introducing From Software and the Souls-like genre to a brand new generation of fans, if you will, who may not have experienced From Software DLC before and may be unprepared for just how piss hard those can be. Like, I like to think of myself as at least decently good at these games.
Yes.
I've played them enough, and I've played them multiple times enough to think that I can get through them all right. But even then, every time I play a DLC, man, I thought I was a Bloodborne pro.
Right.
Me trying to do the old hunters and getting absolutely wrecked by, I think it's like the first major boss in that DLC. I can't remember his name, but it's like a 2-phase one. One where he's like this big beast, and one where he's a big beast, but he's got a big sword. I couldn't believe it. It humbled me in a major way, but that to me is kind of, that's what FromSoft DLC is for, right?
Well,
and
that's the thing.
Sorry to keep rambling, but you also mentioned a good point of one of my issues that I had with Elden Ring's base game was that you could way over level. I like that instead of, conventional difficulty modes. Most of the From games, but especially Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring, they give you options to lower the difficulty via exploration or via, leveling up your character and weapons, or, going somewhere that's a little bit easier than coming back to the challenge. Elden Ring, like you said, was kind of built around that because you had so much more freedom and so many more options. To me, as someone who combs these games like 100%, that did result in some bosses in the late game being taken down in like 2 swings, or some areas that I missed earlier and I was returning to them. I was just over leveled for, and I was kind of steamrolling it. I thought that was, didn't make me hate the game or anything like that, but I always wondered what the experience would be like if I experienced those in the quote unquote correct order. So to me, it's actually music to my ears that there has been this kind of flattening of the play imbalance, if you will, by incorporating this new mechanic that allows you to level up and take on the challenge. Because Elden Ring for me, and Dark Souls in general, is like it's about the exploration as much as it is the actual combat. So I'm gonna, as a player, that's what I want to do. I want to go out and explore, find these things and level up, and then take on the challenge, rather than assuming I am of a level where I can just go in and expect everything to be a cakewalk. One, because that's never been the FromSoft way in many ways, and two, just because I wouldn't want that. If I'd paid this money for an expansion, I wouldn't want to just personally rinse it. That's saying I don't have first-hand experience of the difficulty itself, so maybe it is absolutely ridiculous.
That's the ongoing conversation, is like, when is it too hard? And I get that Miyazaki was asked about that and just said, look, if we make it easier, it breaks the game. Like, as in the appeal of the game, he wants us overcoming certain things. And even if you go way further back to when Demon Souls was coming out, that conversation on, we made it so hard so that you guys would team up. You're not supposed to do this solo. There's been a Twitter thread doing the rounds recently about the original marketing for Dark Souls and how in the West it became prepare to die, and the idea of like you're steeling yourself against these experiences, which is how I've always played them. Like, I like doggedly refuse to summon anybody for like all of the original trilogy and everything, like beating what the hell's the Ornstein and Smile by myself like a maniac, and just I hated that thing. It was horrible. But that being the ongoing conversation for the Souls genre, and obviously you couldn't summon in Sekiro, so you had to steal your way through it, and then get back around to Elden Ring. It's like, if you don't want to summon, you still have access to the mimic tiers, the Ashen stuff. You can still summon AI companions. The DLC has responses to that now, where if you load into a fight with multiple people, or if you load in with the mimic tier or whatever, certain bosses will just do a shockwave immediately to wipe out like everybody that you're with, which is like hilarious. It always makes me think of Mario Maker on Switch or Wii U. Because as soon as Nintendo gave the keys to the kingdom to the public, we all started making horrific experiences that put other players through hell. However, their thing was you couldn't upload a level unless you could beat it yourself. But that was the thing that I opened my eyes as to, like, we'd all be doing this to each other anyway, in regards to thinking of certain game mechanics, or thinking of certain gotchas or whatever. But under the proviso that at some point it is surmountable. However, I think for a FromSoft context, my original DLC for Dark Souls was Dark Souls 2. I went back and got the stuff, the Artorias and everything for Dark Souls 1 later on. But that invisible boss at the start of Dark Souls 2's DLC, where you're just getting beaten by the air because you can't even see it. Things like that made me realize that like FromSoft's DLC is a cut above, and obviously the reputation over the years has only become more associated with that. Like the Orphan of Kos in Bloodborne's DLC, or the Nameless King in Dark Souls 3. Like, over the years, the hardest creatures come from the DLC. Because that is where everything gets filtered down, and we're just seeing that in real time with a way bigger audience.
Well, just to save you before you're killed by the comments, the Nameless King wasn't a DLC boss, but it was a side boss, the hardest boss in that game. But you're right, like the DLC bosses, always looking out for your friend, because I know what the FromSoft hardcore can be like when it comes to the details, and I'm very bad at it.
They've got all I've already been skewered. They're just sort of like, what? Okay, sure. We'll leave them in.
I'll take it. Come on, I'll get them out of here.
Fair enough.
But no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it's, and I'm going to get this wrong now, I think it's the Fume Knight in Dark Souls 2 as well, where it has something like a 98% win ratio, because it just absolutely flattens you, right? Yeah, like that is to be expected from a from software DLC. But I also think it's interesting that it's been such a sort of knee-jerk reaction. Again, I'm not fully coming down one way or another on it because I haven't played it myself, but the likes of the boss that you described there, where there are a few tactics to actually get through the projectiles, that reminds me of my own reaction to Melania from the base game, where I was one of those people, man, who thought I was prepared for everything and then got flattened by her array of moods and moves. I thought it was ridiculous that she got health back even when I was blocking, so I had to, constantly be on the move. I thought her second phase was ridiculous. I thought the what's the move that she does in the first phase? I forget
the dancing blades thing.
Dancing, yeah. That thing. I just thought there's no way to dodge that. I was like, it's broken. It's a broken game. I was one of those people. And then over time, because you're supposed to experiment, you're supposed to explore, you're supposed to talk online and come up with strategies. Slowly, people started getting strategies of how to block those things. And when you know how to block them, it's not easy, but it's easier, and you get that knowledge, right? You can't just, I don't know, with FromSoft bosses, always go in and expect to be able to just dodge roll into an attack and then, kind of win by default. There's often other ways to get around it. So I'm going to be interested to see whether it's another one of those situations, because I understand the reaction to that, again, having done it myself, or if it is just a case of, oh, it's not even that. You've cranked it up kind of too much. And there's not even like counters. It's not just we haven't discovered them. It's like they're not in the game at all.
Well, that's and I'd be amazed if that is the case, where they're fundamentally just screwing you over to make a point or to have a laugh or whatever it is. There has to be some counterpoint to everything. But like I said, I feel like this highlights a conversation about video game difficulty. Like there's the wider discourse of like, how easy do you want your games? Like the whole thing when Shadow of the Erdtree was being reviewed, where Eurogamer knocked it down. They said the final boss was psychotically hard, and they just said, look, it's ludicrous, and I'm going to have to sort of dock some points for it, kind of thing. And that became a talking point of just, saying like, the assumption being that it was beatable and that's by design and whatever. But now that it's out to the mainstream, you've got thousands of reviews knocking it down. Like on Steam, it's just listed as mixed right now. And we'll see how people are getting through it. But I do think, like I said, it highlights a conversation on how brutal do you want your video games? Yeah. If this level of difficulty was in the main game, would it have done so well? Because I would say there are parts of Elden Ring that are still brutally hard. The fire giant was ludicrous when I was fighting him. Yeah. And things like that. And I think that's interesting. Like I'm on the final boss of Stellar Blade right now, and sorry, the second last boss, Raven, and that whole thing is like ludicrously hard in a way that, like, to me the animation priority is not there. I can't block when I want to block. I can't cancel out of things. Eve is flipping through the air when I just want to parry, stuff like that. And then you look at the trophy percentages, and it's like, yeah, that makes sense. Like 40% of people got through this, 30%, 20%. And in an industry where we're talking about completion rates and how much of a project is worth greenlighting, people are going to get roadblocked here and there. I think it's an interesting wider talking point. If gaming gets bigger, more people play these games, do those more people then bounce off again?
Maybe so, maybe so. I think, for me, the appeal of an expansion or a DLC pack or whatever is always to experiment and do something a little bit different. And we've mentioned some of the great FromSoft DLC so far, but I always feel like they're not purposefully obtuse, but you have to sort of prove yourself in the main game to a certain degree to even unlock the DLC for the most part in these titles. Like usually the unlock point comes quite far into the game. You can't just kind of jump in at the start. You have to get to grips with the mechanics. But what I like about not just the DLCs, but even some pivots from Software themselves, be it Sekiro or Elden Ring, is that they always want to find ways to challenge you. The issue that I have with Dark Souls 2 and 3 is that because they play so similar to 1, when you're in that rhythm and you get that muscle memory, you can kind of steamroll it. Of course, they're going to be challenged, but you've overcome a certain element of challenge already that your skill levels kind of increased, right? Yeah. And then it becomes, for me anyway, it became a little bit rote in those sequels, whereas I loved Sekiro because it was the first time after a few From Software games where I got my ass kicked from the get-go. But it wasn't just about getting my ass kicked. It was about learning new things. It was learning that the old rules don't apply and that I've got to focus on parrying this time around, that I can't level up in the same way to circumvent challenge, so I'm going to have to really get into the rhythm side of things and analyze actual attacks. I think I said it at the time, it was either Bloodborne or Sekiro that made me actually understand how to read a boss's attack, because previously when I played through Dark Souls for the first time, I kind of was just going off instinct, and that's why I was getting killed so much, because I wasn't really analyzing, okay, if he does this, he's going to do that, or this wind up means this. I was just diving into everything, hoping to get by on that kind of like natural instinct and reflex, right? And then when I played Sekiro, went back to Dark Souls, had a whole different game plan, because then I was incorporating those elements, and the same with Bloodborne and going back as well. So if a DLC or a new From Software game didn't have that tweak to it and didn't have that challenge to it, that's kind of, again, I can only speak from my own personal preference, but that's what I want. I want to go into an addition and have to learn something new, or have to adapt and not just go in with the old skills and expect them to kind of get me through. It raises the question of what you said, though, of is that what other people want? I can say I want that, but is that good for the game? Is that good for other people?
Well, that's what I think is fascinating. And just the way that it's all kind of shaken out of, like, in this case, you do need to break away from the fight that is giving you trouble and go explore and try and get some of these fragments or whatever to get stronger. But obviously you could then argue that if every single NPC you're coming across is flattening you, then that you can't even have the joy of exploration. But it's, Andy Murray over on the wrestling channel is enjoying the DLC. He's like, yeah, it's hard, but like if I make a point of collecting these things, I can get there. To me, it's fascinating, and maybe I'll do an editorial or something, some conversation on this, that Souls as a set of games, especially Dark Souls, it was Dark Souls that blew up the most. Demons was 2 years prior, but it was Dark Souls that really blew up, even years after its release. The marketing around that almost does a disservice to how you're supposed to play the game. If you could detach all of the prepare to die and the wider reputation, if you could detach all of the, can you actually survive? How strong is your gamer metal? Are you really going to get through this? If you detach all of that and just play the game with the elements that it's presenting to you, the messaging system, in Elden Ring's case, the different ashen summons and things like that, you might have a more palatable experience, as opposed to going into these games like I have done for years, thinking like I will do this myself because I want the challenge, as opposed to I have all of these other things available to me, like I said, summoning other people in or whatever. Like it became almost a meme or a thing to say, I'm not going to summon, let me solo her, was a whole thing for Elden Ring. Like if you did, no other franchise really has that, where it's like there's a way to play that is actually away from the game itself.
That's interesting. I do think it sort of links in what I was just saying there about like those expectations and stuff, because I do think no matter what FromSoft game you are playing, sometimes there is a consensus of there is a way to play it, even like you said, if the game is kind of indicating otherwise. Like, I know they're very similar aesthetically and mechanically, but with the Ashen Summons and everything else in Elden Ring, you probably shouldn't play that the exact same way you played Dark Souls, because the same tricks aren't going to apply, and you're encouraged to use the Ashens if you're having a tough time, or going to another location and not just throwing your head against the brick wall, come back when you're more leveled up and stuff. And that's kind of always happened, whether it's Dark Souls to Bloodborne with the rallying system or just the increased agility, Sekiro, like I said, with the parrying, and then over to this, there's always been that tweak. And there is sometimes a steadfast mentality of, oh no, but we still got to approach it this way. And it's like, but the games are changing, the games are evolving, and the DLC is evolving.
Totally. Just to throw in as well, like FromSoft are in on that joke. Like in Bloodborne, they gave you that really crappy shield that was like, oh, if you want to play trying to tank the hit, you can try,
of course, but
it won't do anything. You need, in Bloodborne's case, you need to stick and move, dodge, get your health back by being more aggressive. Like, they coded that in. Like it's a way of trying to teach the player how to play. And in Elden Ring's case, it is an impetus on collectibles, or at least it is for the early parts of the DLC. I just think the whole thing is fascinating. And I think the bigger, what used to be the most niche of niche games, like having been around since like watching the whole thing roll out. I remember when Demon's Souls was new in 2009 and how incredibly awkward that game was. And everybody was just like, obviously it had its fans, but at the time it was like, what the hell is this thing? It was written off by the critics. It was written off by the majority of people. Even Dark Souls 1 didn't really take off until about 2013, 2 years after it came out, largely because a lot of people were just looking for something to play at the start of that generation. And then we've gone strength to strength to strength. So like, it's really fascinating looking at it all now, and then looking at the biggest audience possible, and their interactions with what were always obtuse mentalities or off-putting, particularly off-putting in quotes, mentalities at the heart of these games. because that is what people love about them. But like, it's just interesting that that's what got those people in. But then in theory, they are now going, nah, it's too much. It actually is broken, or it's too much. I just think the whole thing is really interesting.
You know, we're recording this literally, what, 3 days? Like, less than 4. I don't know what time is anymore. Less than 4 days from the launch of the game, right? So, I mean,
just
I know people will have absolutely smashed it, but it seems like a short time frame, and like I described it as a knee-jerk reaction. And it reminds me, similar to you, I was around when Dark Souls 1 dropped, and I was put off that game forever because the reception to it wasn't the reception that it is today. There were, of course, some glowing reviews at the time, but I remember watching reviews and people were just saying it's unfairly hard. Now the mantra of FromSoft is tough but fair, right? But at the time it was like, nah, this is unfairly hard. Parts are broken. It's like, only go into this if you're like the toughest of the tough and you're wanting to be punished. And like you said, the marketing of the Prepare to Die edition maybe didn't do that justice either. It kind of had this reputation of being this punishing and unfair game when it kind of wasn't really, but it took time for people to get to grips with the systems and kind of come to that conclusion. And I think Elden Ring didn't have the same issue because it was so open and so accessible. But if the DLC is a kind of return to that previous approach, I'm going to be interested to see how people react to the DLC in the expansion over time. Like, how is it going to sit in a year's time? Will people look back and still think, oh yeah, you know what, that was too far even for FromSoft? Or will they be like, oh, okay, once we got to grips with it, once we shared these strategies, it was digestible in the same way that Dark Souls 1 was eventually digestible? I don't know.
Yeah, you would hope so. I mean, on a long enough timeline, like obviously they've FromSoft have responded to Elden Ring by patching in map markers and tweaking a few things like across the last 2 years, but nothing that's meaningfully upended a system or whatever.